Leaders around the world say they were blindsided Saturday after learning of the U.S. and Israel's early morning strikes against Iran, which has plunged the Middle East into another conflict.
La France n'a été ni prévenue ni impliquée.
French President Emmanuel Macron saying France was not made aware of the strike ahead of time, just like, quote, all the other countries in the region.
So it is clear they must never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon.
Posting on X, Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi said those talks have once again been undermined, urging the U.S. not to get sucked into a war that isn't theirs. The severity of this latest escalation has not only rocked the stability of the Middle East, but has the potential to have major impacts to the global oil market.
At 2:17 a.m. Tehran time, the power grid flickered. Within 60 seconds, oil futures spiked 6%. By sunrise, missiles were airborne. And by the time most of the world sat down for breakfast, the question wasn't whether a war had started. The question was whether anyone could stop it. Ali Khamenei is dead. Let that sit for a moment. The man who ran one of the most complex, resilient, and ruthless theocratic systems on the planet for over 3 decades is gone. And what happened next wasn't a moment of silence. It was a missile barrage. It was streets split between mourning and dancing. It was Donald Trump going on record with a threat so stark, so direct, that even his own allies went quiet. He said he would hit back with force never seen before. Not force, not military action. Force never seen before. That's not a press release. That's a declaration.
Well, it's great to be with you on this historic event. Look, Iran so far has been responding through its usual playbook we've seen over the last 3 years of volleying these huge barrages of missiles and drones, making big threats. Of course, the question becomes their capability and really what they have right now at the moment in this hour of desperation. The question for me, too, we've never seen Iran this weak or this desperate. And so it's a little bit like with a caged wild animal. You never know. There's an unpredictability factor there.
And right now, the entire architecture of Middle Eastern geopolitics, the global oil supply, and the economic stability of countries that have nothing to do with this war are all hanging on what happens in the next 72 hours. This is not background noise. This is the main event, and you need to understand exactly what is happening, who is pulling the strings, and what it means for the world you live in. So let's start from the moment the missiles left the ground. Iran did not pause. That's the first thing you need to understand. There was no cabinet meeting, no emergency UN address, no quiet back-channel message to Washington saying, let's talk. Within hours of Khamenei's death being confirmed, the Iranian military launched what analysts are already calling one of the most coordinated retaliatory strikes in the region's modern history. And this wasn't targeted. This wasn't surgical. This was volume. This was desperation wrapped in firepower. Missiles hit Israeli positions. U.S. bases took direct strikes. And then something happened that nobody had fully predicted. Gulf states, specifically the UAE and Bahrain, found their infrastructure targeted too. Think about that for a second. These are the same countries that were quietly pushing for a diplomatic off-ramp. These are the governments that had been in back-channel conversations, trying to bring Iran and the United States to a table before everything exploded. Iran didn't just strike its enemies. Iran struck the people trying to save it. That tells you everything about the mental state of whoever gave that order.
While Russia urged the U.S. and Israel to stop their strikes immediately and return to a, quote, path of political and diplomatic settlement, as Moscow continues to rely on Iranian drones to unceasingly bomb Ukraine. The U.S. strikes on Iran come as the two countries were in the middle of negotiations to end Iran's nuclear capabilities, a process Oman's foreign minister appeared optimistic about just Friday, as the country has served as a mediator between the two sides.
I am confident and in my assessment of the way the talks are going.
Now here's where the geography matters, and it matters more than most people realize. The United States doesn't keep its presence in this region as a symbolic gesture. There are forward operating bases, logistics hubs, and naval positioning that form a containment ring around Iran. Israel sits on the western edge, with air superiority that is arguably unmatched in the region. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which controls the Persian Gulf. The UAE has become one of the most militarily modernized countries in the Arab world. When Iran fired at all of these simultaneously, it wasn't a military strategy, it was a signal. It was the regime saying, "We know we may not survive this, but we are going to make as much noise as possible on the way out." The question military analysts are asking right now is simple. Were these strikes effective? And the honest answer is, compared to what Iran is capable of and compared to past strikes, these were less devastating than expected. The interception rates were high. The damage was real, but not catastrophic. And that gap between the threat and the outcome tells you something critical about the actual state of Iran's military capability right now. It has been degraded. Months of targeted strikes by U.S. and Israeli forces have quietly taken apart pieces of the infrastructure that was supposed to make Iran untouchable. The retaliation happened, but it didn't land the way Tehran needed it to. And here is something that most people are not talking about. The timing of these strikes matters as much as the strikes themselves. Iran launched everything it had in the immediate window after Khamenei's death. That suggests a pre-planned protocol, a dead man's switch, essentially. The order wasn't given in that moment. The order was already in place, which means whoever is now running Iran did not choose this escalation. They inherited it. And there is a significant difference between a government that chooses war and a government that wakes up inside one. The choices available to the interim council right now are not the same choices Khamenei would have had. They are managing a situation, not directing one. And that distinction will matter enormously in the days ahead. Now let's talk about Trump, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. For the past month, there has been a visible hesitation in Washington. Not weakness, hesitation, and understanding the difference matters. The people around Trump were not arguing against military action because they were afraid of Iran. They were asking a question that doesn't have a clean answer. What happens the morning after? There are two scenarios that any serious strategic thinker has to grapple with right now. The first scenario, you hit Iran hard enough to force them to the negotiating table. You degrade their military to the point where the surviving leadership looks at the rubble and decides that a deal is better than annihilation. This is the deterrence doctrine in action. You create so much pain that the cost of continuing outweighs the ideology. It has worked in history. It has also failed spectacularly in history. The second scenario, you hit Iran hard enough to destabilize the regime, but not hard enough to finish it. And what you're left with is not a weakened Iran willing to negotiate. What you're left with is a fractured, radicalized, weaponized fragment of a regime that has nothing left to lose. In revolutionary systems, the moderates get pushed out first when the walls close in. The people who survive internal collapse in these governments are not the diplomats. They are the true believers. And true believers, with access to weapons and nothing left to protect, are the most dangerous force in geopolitics. Trump is operating on the first theory. He believes, or his posture suggests he believes, that maximum pressure applied at the right moment creates the conditions for either a deal or a collapse that the Iranian people themselves finish. He is not listening to Moscow's calls for a path of political settlement. He is not engaging with Beijing's quiet signals. He is not picking up the phone for Brussels. He has looked at this moment, and decided that this is the opportunity, and he is not going to let diplomatic caution turn it into a missed window. Whether he is right is a question that history will answer, but the strategy is clear. This is escalation dominance. You establish such overwhelming superiority of force and will that the other side recalculates. The risk is that the other side doesn't recalculate. The risk is that they escalate in return. But there is a third risk that nobody in Washington is saying out loud. What if the other side simply endures? What if the regime absorbs the strikes, loses territory, loses commanders, loses infrastructure, and still does not fall? What if the Iranian street, which today is divided, looks at foreign bombs falling on Iranian soil and unites, not around the regime's ideology, but around something older and more powerful than ideology? National identity. It happened in Iraq, it happened in Afghanistan. External military pressure applied without a credible political alternative does not always produce regime change. Sometimes it produces national consolidation around the very government the pressure was meant to destroy. This is the scenario that keeps serious analysts awake at night. Not that Trump's strategy fails loudly, but that it fails slowly. And in failing slowly, it creates a version of Iran that is more dangerous, more isolated, and more willing to use every tool it has than the version that existed before the first strike. And that's where the Strait of Hormuz enters the conversation. And when it does, this stops being a regional conflict and becomes everyone's problem. Just to be transparent here, everything I'm walking you through is drawn from public reporting, open source intelligence analysis, and historical context. The analysis and framing is my own read of events. You are completely free to see this differently. There is no agenda here, no side being pushed. This is about understanding a situation that is moving faster than most people can track. Now let's talk about what's happening inside Iran, because this is the part most coverage is glossing over, and it is arguably the most important piece of the entire puzzle. When Khamenei died, the constitutional mechanism kicked in automatically. An interim council was formed. It consists of the president, the head of the judiciary, and a religious figure from the Supreme Council. On paper, this is orderly succession. On paper, the Islamic Republic has a plan for this moment. But here's the thing about revolutionary systems that people consistently underestimate. Power in these governments doesn't transfer cleanly. It fractures. And the fracture lines in Iran right now run deep. There are three distinct centers of power that are not necessarily aligned. First, the street. And the street in Iran is not monolithic. There are Iranians who are genuinely mourning. For them, Khamenei was not just a political figure. He was a spiritual anchor, a symbol of resistance against what they see as Western imperialism. Their grief is real, but alongside that grief, in other neighborhoods, in other cities, there are Iranians who have been waiting for this moment for a long time. We saw what was bubbling under the surface during the Mahsa Amini protests. That was not a small movement. That was a country telling its government, the social contract is broken. Independent estimates suggest that genuine support for the Islamic Republic has dropped from around 60 to 70% 2 decades ago to below 40% today, possibly as low as 30. That is a regime sitting on a majority that no longer believes in it. Second, the clerical establishment. This is where Khamenei's succession becomes genuinely murky. Reports indicate that the interim council actually ignored Khamenei's stated preferences for his successor and defaulted to the constitutional framework instead. That is not a small detail, that is a signal. Even within the religious leadership, the consensus that Khamenei maintained through sheer force of personality and longevity is already fracturing. The clerics are not united, they are positioning. And positioning in a system without a clear center of gravity is how civil wars inside governments begin. Not with weapons, with meetings, with phone calls, with quiet decisions about who gets told what and who gets left out of the room. Third, and this is the one that matters most in the short term, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is not simply the Iranian military. It is a parallel state. It has its own economy, its own intelligence apparatus, its own foreign policy, executed through proxies across the region. The question that nobody has a clean answer to right now is whether the interim council actually controls the IRGC, or whether the IRGC is operating as a rogue actor within a disintegrating system. Because if it is the latter, then the missiles we saw launched after Khamenei's death may not have been a state decision. They may have been a faction decision. And a faction with missiles and nothing to lose is a very different problem than a state with missiles and something to protect. In revolutionary systems, power rarely transfers, it fractures. And right now, Iran is fracturing in real time. Empires don't fall in a single explosion. They unravel in decisions made under pressure. And tonight, those decisions are being made inside buildings we cannot see, by people whose names we don't know, with calculations driven entirely by survival. Now let's pull back in Chausur Waxmai Consultural and look at how the rest of the world is responding, because the reactions from the major powers tell you something important about where the real lines are. Emmanuel Macron and France's broader posture captures the European position in one word: blindsided. That word is significant. The US and Israel did not give their European allies advance notice of the strikes that set this in motion. That is a deliberate choice. It is not an oversight. When you don't tell your allies in advance, it is because you know they would have objected, and you didn't want the objection on record before the operation. France, Germany, the broader EU, they are now in the uncomfortable position of having to respond to a crisis they were excluded from creating. Keir Starmer and the UK have taken a different posture. British forces are conducting defensive operations to protect Allied assets in the region. The UK is not pretending this isn't happening. But there is a very careful line being walked between supporting the alliance and endorsing the escalation. Russia's position is the most cynical and also the most revealing. Moscow is calling for the US to return to a path of political settlement. Moscow is urging restraint. Moscow is positioning itself as the voice of reason. And simultaneously, Russia is using Iranian-manufactured drones to strike Ukrainian civilians. The hypocrisy is not accidental. It is a deliberate performance for a global audience that Russia is betting will notice the contradiction and draw conclusions about Western credibility. China is quieter, but don't mistake quiet for uninvolved. Beijing is watching this very carefully. It is the largest buyer of Iranian oil. It has deep economic interest in regional stability, and it is watching how the United States handles this moment as a data point for its own calculations about Taiwan and the Western Pacific. Oman is perhaps the most telling case. Just days ago, Oman's government was optimistic. They were actively mediating. There were credible reports of progress on nuclear talks. Oman's foreign minister is now saying those talks have been undermined, and there is a warning being sent to Washington not to get drawn into a war that isn't theirs to own. That's a mediator telling you the table has been flipped, and here is the question that cuts through all of these reactions. Who benefits from chaos? Not from Iran winning, not from the US winning, from chaos itself, from prolonged instability, from oil price volatility, from a Middle East too consumed in conflict to function as a coherent geopolitical bloc. Russia benefits. Its energy revenues increase as Western alternatives get disrupted. Certain arms manufacturers benefit. Certain political factions in multiple countries benefit from the narrative of existential threat. Chaos is not always an accident. Sometimes, it is an outcome that serves interests that are never named in the press conference. And here is the part that rarely gets said clearly. Every major conflict in recent history has produced a class of people who got richer, not because they caused the conflict, but because they were positioned for it. Defense contracts accelerate. Energy investments that looked risky suddenly look visionary. Political careers built on fear find new fuel. This is not a conspiracy. This is how incentive structures work, and understanding who benefits tells you something important about who is not quietly working to end this. Now let's talk about your gas tank. Let's talk about your grocery bill. Let's talk about what this means for economies that have no soldiers in this fight. The Revolutionary Guard has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. This is a waterway roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. And through that narrow passage flows approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply, not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of the world's oil. A significant portion of global liquefied natural gas shipments moves through this corridor too. For Japan, the closure of the strait is not an inconvenience. It is an economic emergency. Japan imports roughly 90% of its oil through this passage. South Korea faces the same equation. India, which has been carefully balancing its relationships with both Washington and Tehran, would face immediate fuel supply pressure. A partial closure has happened before. Markets absorbed it, but a full sustained closure that is unprecedented in the modern era. Analysts are not being alarmist when they say oil prices could reach $140 a barrel. We have already seen futures jump significantly in the hours following the strikes. Volatility alone, before a single tanker is blocked, is already moving prices. Insurance rates on vessels attempting to transit the Gulf have spiked sharply. Shipping companies are already rerouting, which means longer transit times, higher costs, and tighter supply chains for goods that have nothing to do with oil directly, but depend entirely on the fuel that moves them. If you are sitting in North America thinking this is a foreign policy story, look at the macro domino effect. Higher oil prices feed directly into transportation costs. Transportation costs feed into food prices. Food prices feed into inflation. Inflation forces central bank responses. Central bank responses affect mortgage rates, consumer credit, business investment. The Strait of Hormuz is not a geography question. It is a household finance question, and it could go from theoretical to very real within weeks if this escalation continues. The Gulf states, with their modern defense systems and U.S. partnerships, are better positioned than most to absorb the immediate military threat. But even they cannot insulate their economies from the second and third order effects of sustained regional instability. The UAE has built itself into a global financial and logistics hub. That model depends entirely on the perception of stability. The moment that perception cracks, capital moves, and capital is already watching nervously. Now consider the countries that are not in the news cycle at all. Pakistan sits on Iran's eastern border. It has a large Shia population. It has nuclear weapons. It has its own internal political fragility right now. A spillover of refugees, of sectarian tension, of economic pressure from oil price shocks hits Pakistan in ways that could produce instability far beyond what anyone in Washington is currently modeling. Turkey is watching its energy costs. Egypt is watching the Suez Canal traffic slow. Every country that depends on remittances from workers in Gulf states is quietly running the numbers. This conflict has a radius that is much wider than the missile ranges on any map. So where does this leave us? Iran's military capability is degraded, but not destroyed. The regime is in a period of constitutional transition that is legally structured, but practically fragile. The IRGC's chain of command is unclear. The Iranian people are divided in ways that could either produce a political opening or deepen into something far more violent. Trump has committed to a posture of maximum pressure, with no clear diplomatic off-ramp that both sides can credibly accept. The global powers are fragmented in their responses, and the most influential voices for restraint carry the least credibility for their own reasons. The global economy has its hands on a pressure valve called the Strait of Hormuz. That one decision could turn. A cornered regime is not a defeated regime. That distinction matters enormously. History is full of examples of governments that were weaker than their enemies, surrounded, economically strangled, militarily outmatched, who nevertheless managed to inflict catastrophic damage on their way to whatever came next. The question is not simply whether Iran can be defeated. The question is what that process looks like, how long it takes, how many people it involves, and whether the thing that emerges on the other side is better, worse, or simply different. The Iranian people are not their government. That is not a diplomatic nicety. It is a factual statement about a population that is young, educated, connected to the outside world in ways that previous generations were not. A population that has demonstrated at enormous personal cost that it is willing to push back against the system it is living under. What they need is not a foreign war fought on their soil. What they need is a political transition that doesn't leave a vacuum filled by whoever has the most guns and the least to lose. Whether the current trajectory leads there is genuinely uncertain. Anyone telling you they know exactly how this ends is either lying or selling something. What I can tell you is that the status quo is gone. It left the room at 2:17 a.m. Tehran time, and it is not coming back. The decisions being made right now in war rooms and interim councils and Oval Office briefings and IRGC command centers will determine the shape of the next 20 years, not just for Iran, not just for Israel, not just for the United States, for every country whose economy runs on oil, for every family whose savings are tied to markets that are already trembling. For every person in a city that has nothing to do with this war, but will feel its weight regardless. This is what it looks like when a decades-long standoff finally breaks. Not cleanly, not quickly, but with consequences that spread further than the missiles and longer than the headlines. Empires don't fall in a single explosion. They unravel in decisions made under pressure. And tonight, those decisions are being made. Everything covered here is based on public reporting, historical context, and independent analysis. The framing is my own read of events, drawn entirely from what is publicly available. You are fully entitled to your own perspective on all of this. That's not a disclaimer. That's the point. The most dangerous thing right now is not the missiles. It's people on every side of this who stopped asking questions. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually at stake, share it with someone who needs to. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, because it is developing fast, and the next 72 hours could change the framing entirely. Drop your take in the comments. Specifically, do you think Trump's pressure doctrine leads to a deal, a collapse, or a catastrophic escalation? And here's a second question worth sitting with. If this conflict expands, which country do you think gets pulled in next? Not the obvious ones. Think about the edges. Think about the countries nobody is watching right now. Because in conflicts like this, the most important developments rarely happen at the center. They happen at the margins, where nobody is looking. I want to read what you actually think, because right now, the people asking the hard questions out loud matter more than they usually do.